Hi everyone, I'm Nora, and for this week's assignment, I chose to research IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and it's a law that's in the US. The first kind of um, enactment of the IDEA was actually called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and that was signed by President Ford in 1975. And what that did was it really opened the doors of public schools to children that had disabilities, and it gave them the equality of educational opportunity. It wanted to provide them with full participation in the classroom and ultimately set them up for independent living as well as being self-sufficient economically. So the IDEA kind of has six big principles to it, so I'll go over each of those with you. The first one was to make sure that there was free, appropriate public education for those with disabilities. This ends up falling on the responsibility of the public schools and the local school boards, making sure that there's access for kids that have disabilities in public education. The second principle was the appropriate evaluation of students with disabilities. So this needs to be implemented by really knowledgeable and well-trained individuals that are able to collaborate together and evaluate a student based off their prior work in order to decide what the best needs or what the best kind of plan for that student is. And that kind of goes along with the third principle, which is this individualized education plan. Um, the individualized education plan is a written document, and it draws, like I said, on documents from previous years in school of that student, and it takes into consideration where that student is and where that student needs to be going. So they're going to make sure that they cover any academic, developmental, social needs of that student. And then it's going to go through and outline different goal setting and how they're going to be able to reach those goals and what accommodations are going to be provided for that student. Um, with doing that, the fourth principle is a least restrictive environment. So, along with providing appropriate free education for these children, the goal is to keep them in their general classroom as much as possible. So it's exploring like the individualized education plan is going to explore alternatives to having to pull these children out of the classroom and have one-on-one help or a different group classroom learning environment. They want to keep these children in with other non-need children, and they can do this in a variety of ways. Some of the ways that they've outlined are some classroom modifications, different learning, teaching approaches, instructional aids, and any supplemental aids that children can use visually or technological aids, things like that. Um, the fifth principle out of the six principles is parent participation, and this one's really important. Um, they want parents to make sure that they feel the right to be involved in placement decisions that are being made for their child, and that if at any point they want to, that they can refuse any further evaluation or decisions to provide alternate forms of supplemental materials and things like that to the children. The final principle was the procedural safeguards, and so this is meant to protect the parents in order to give them access to information about placement, and then if a disagreement does arise, those parents can then take it up with a person in the school board or higher up if it needs to go that way. There were quite a few different strengths and weaknesses that I found when I was researching this law. I would say there were a lot of strengths that kind of had a counterpart to them. I really liked the idea of inclusion, and I think that that was part of what this act is trying to do, is move the classroom towards a more inclusive classroom. It supports more local control of classrooms instead of having more of the control be in the state or district. It Also, I think another positive is that it really requires collaboration of different experts in their field of knowledge in order to come together and decide what the most practical and best goals and approaches for each student's individual needs are. I think it also, the ACT celebrates diversity. It's bringing in different learning styles and different types of students into the classroom so that they're able to learn from one another, and then it also promotes addressing learning needs in all of their different kind of in all the different ways that they can manifest in all their different forms. It does require a variety of different teaching strategies too, by opening the doors to students with disabilities. And for the teacher, it can be really helpful in having a student with disabilities be in their classroom. They can learn from other students' interactions for social competence or for behavior management, how they need to manage their own behaviors. And it can also help with building social skills. Some of the downsides to some of the principles for the free and appropriate public education, there can be discrepancies between parents and schools on what the district finds is appropriate free education for a student as opposed to what the students maybe test scores and things are showing and what the parents are thinking. In reality, the way that ends up playing out maybe sometimes doesn't always line up. When it comes to the evaluations for students, the evaluations are really only as good as the evaluators, and making sure that the right funds from this act are being allocated towards professional development for the people in the field that are doing these evaluations is really important. For the individualized education plan portion of the act, I think that one, it's an actual legal document, and so that would definitely motivate educators to want to come up with goals that are going to be attainable on paper for their students in order to preserve their teaching career. It can also be quite time consuming in terms of actually filling out and having meetings and getting everybody coordinated. And so the downside of all the wonderful information you can get from an IEP is just the time commitment and paperwork necessary to complete that. The least restrictive education and environment for some children, that may be really wonderful that they're being incorporated into a general classroom. For others, maybe say with autism, things like that, that could be kind of a double-edged sword, and it could benefit really well for the student, or it could also maybe not end up being the best situation. What an administrator or what the school side of the argument and what the parent side of the argument is in terms of how they're defining the least restrictive environment for learning is going to be maybe a topic of discussion. And the procedural safeguards, I know working with special needs students that oftentimes parents don't feel that they're on the equal playing ground or have the right resources to have their voices be heard as much as any educational professional. And so that could be another downside to this act, is that even though everybody's voices are trying to be heard equally, that they're not. That was more or less all I had to say about this act. I find it really interesting, and I think it's also really interesting working at an American school with American curriculum, but it's a private school, seeing the differences in resources compared to what public schools back home are able to provide for these children. Resources meaning out here just technological resources, and as well as personnel resources. The amount of people, professionals to students that have learning disabilities in a private school, and the resources that are included for that student in a private school compared to the public school is definitely much more, although public schools under this act should be receiving some of the same things that we're receiving in our school out here. So there were just some really interesting kind of points that were brought up in terms of wanting to have a level playing field for everybody, but what does that actually mean, and have we really figured that out yet, or are we still kind of going for a working definition on that? Thanks. Sorry I went over on the time, and I'll see you guys in class.